Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Today, we're heading to Ottawa, Canada, on December 1st, 1867, the day the first Canadian Parliament opened its doors. And here's what fascinates me about this moment. It wasn't just the birth of a new government. It was an experiment to see whether people who deeply disagreed could learn to govern together without tearing everything apart. Picture this scene. It's a freezing December morning in Ottawa, and inside a newly constructed Parliament building, men in formal Victorian attire are gathering for something that had never happened before. They're about to open the first Parliament of a united Canada, a country that just 5 months earlier hadn't existed. But here's the thing that I always wonder about. What was that morning like for them? Because the men walking into that chamber didn't all want to be there. Some had fought bitterly against the Confederation. Others had grudgingly accepted it as the least bad option. And a very few, genuinely believed this crazy experiment might actually work. Let me build the clock for you, because understanding what Parliament meant in 1867 helps us understand what we're still arguing about today. Think about it this way. In 1867, Canada wasn't born because everyone suddenly decided they loved each other and wanted to be one big happy family. Canada was born because staying separate had become too dangerous, too expensive, and too complicated to survive. The American Civil War had just ended, and the Americans had the largest army in the world, sitting right across the border. Britain was tired of defending its North American colonies. The economy was struggling, and these separate British colonies, Canada West, Canada East, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, they'd been squabbling with each other for decades. So here's what the evidence tells us. Confederation wasn't really about shared vision. It was about shared fear and shared necessity, which, if you think about it, is how most important political arrangements actually get made. But the genius, and I mean that word carefully, the genius was in how they designed the system. They were trying to solve an almost impossible problem. How do you create a government strong enough actually to govern, but flexible enough that regions with completely different interests, languages, religions, and cultures would agree to participate? The answer they came up with was Parliament. Not just any Parliament, but a specifically designed machine with multiple gears that had to work together. Here's how they built it. 2 chambers. The House of Commons, where representation was based on population, gave power to the larger provinces. And the Senate, where regions got equal representation regardless of size. This protected smaller provinces from being overwhelmed. The Prime Minister and Cabinet came from Parliament itself, which meant the executive branch was always accountable to the legislative branch. And critically, this is where it gets interesting, the provinces kept significant powers over education, healthcare, and local matters. Think about what they were really building, a system designed to force cooperation. The federal government couldn't ignore the provinces. The provinces couldn't ignore each other. Nobody could just ram their preferences through without negotiation, compromise, and deal-making. Now here's what makes that opening day on December 1st so remarkable. It actually worked. Against considerable odds, they showed up and started governing. The first Parliament had to tackle some massive challenges immediately. They needed to buy Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company, basically the entire center of what would become Canada. They had to negotiate with indigenous peoples. They needed to build a transcontinental railroad. They had to establish courts, currency, a postal system, and trade agreements. They were literally building a country from scratch. But what I find myself thinking about is this. Look at who was in that room. You had John A. MacDonald, the architect of Confederation, who was brilliant, pragmatic, and often drunk. You had George-Étienne representing French Catholic Quebec, fighting to protect language and religious rights. You had Joseph Howe from Nova Scotia, who'd campaigned passionately against Confederation and was now trying to make the best of a situation he hated. These weren't people who naturally agreed. They came from different cultures, spoke different languages, and represented fundamentally different visions of what Canada should be. The evidence shows they genuinely didn't trust each other much, and yet they made it work. Not perfectly. History shows us the mistakes, the injustices, the policies we rightly condemn today. But they made it work well enough that the system they created that day is still functioning 158 years later. Here's what the investigator in me notices. They succeeded not by eliminating their differences, but by designing a system that could contain those differences without exploding. The parliamentary structure gave everyone a voice. The federal-provincial division gave everyone some control. The requirement for coalition building meant nobody could govern alone. I always wonder what that first session felt like. The procedural votes, the debates over rules, the jockeying for committee positions, all the mundane machinery of democracy being assembled in real time. Because here's the thing. Democracy isn't actually about the big dramatic moments. It's about whether you can show up day after day and argue with people you disagree with and somehow find enough common ground to keep the whole thing running. We're still making versions of that same choice today. And I think this is where the story gets especially relevant for us right now. Look at our own political moment. We're deeply divided. We question whether our systems can hold. We wonder if people with fundamentally different worldviews can actually govern together anymore. The debates get nasty. The rhetoric gets extreme. People genuinely question whether democracy still works. And here's what fascinates me. We're asking the same questions they were asking in 1867. Think about it. Canada was born at a moment when nobody was sure democracy could handle deep divisions. They had language barriers, religious conflicts, regional economic rivalries, and fundamental disagreements about what kind of society they were building. Sound familiar? The pattern repeats. The question repeats. Can a diverse democracy actually function? Here's what the evidence from that first parliament tells us. Yes, but only if you design the system correctly and everyone agrees to show up and participate, even when they don't get everything they want. They created mechanisms to ensure minority voices were heard. They built in requirements for compromise. They distributed power so no single group could dominate. They made governing hard, deliberately hard, because they understood that easy governing usually means someone's getting trampled. We're still living with that design. When Americans debate eliminating the Electoral College or reforming the Senate, they're having the 1867 Canada conversation. When Europeans argue about EU governance and national sovereignty, they're working through the same tensions. When we fight about federalism versus states' rights, about regional interests versus national interests, about majority rule versus minority protection, we're all wrestling with the machinery that Parliament was designed to manage. I find myself thinking about this a lot lately. The easy answer when democracy feels broken is to blame the system, to say the machinery doesn't work anymore, to argue that we need something radically different. But what that first parliament teaches us is different. The machinery isn't the problem. The machinery is neutral. It works if you work it. What matters is whether the people using the system still believe in the fundamental bargain, that we show up, we argue, we compromise, we govern together even when we profoundly disagree. Here's what troubles me, and I'll be honest with you, I see us forgetting that lesson. We treat political opponents as enemies rather than adversaries. We prioritize winning over governing. We mistake compromise for weakness rather than recognizing it as the price of democracy. Those men walking into Parliament on December 1st, 1867, they didn't like each other much. Joseph Howe thought MacDonald was a conniving drunk. French and English Canadians deeply distrusted each other. The Maritimes felt pushed around by central Canada. But they showed up anyway. They participated anyway. They governed anyway. That's not a small thing. That's the entire thing. So, as we think about that cold December morning in Ottawa 158 years ago, I think the question for us isn't really about Parliament or democracy or political systems. The question is more straightforward and harder. Are we still willing to do what they did? Are we willing to show up and argue with people we disagree with, knowing we won't get everything we want? Are we willing to build systems that are deliberately inefficient because that inefficiency protects everyone's interests? Are we willing to see our political opponents as necessary participants in democracy rather than obstacles to be eliminated? Because here's the thing. That first Parliament succeeded not because Canadians agreed on everything, but because they agreed on one thing, that arguing together was better than fighting apart. That imperfect union was better than perfect separation. That democracy, messy and frustrating as it was, beat the alternatives. The mechanisms they built that day, Parliament, federalism, minority rights, required compromise. Those weren't just Canadian inventions. They were solutions to the universal problem of how people from different backgrounds govern together. And they still work if we still believe in them. I always come back to this. Democracy isn't a machine that runs itself. It's a practice, a discipline, a choice we make every day to show up and participate even when we'd rather not, especially when we'd rather not. On December 1st, 1867, a group of men who didn't particularly like each other walked into a building in Ottawa and chose to govern together. They could have walked away. They could have let the whole experiment collapse. Instead, they showed up and did the work. That choice, that simple, difficult, essential choice, is still available to us. The question is whether we'll make it. The great philosopher George-Étienne once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And here's why that matters today. We're facing the same test those men faced in 1867. The question isn't whether we'll have divisions. We will. The question is whether we'll remember that democracy works only when we choose to make it work, even when it's hard. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, think about what it means to choose democracy, even when it's hard, because that's what they did on this day. In 1867, and it's what we're still being asked to do today.